I'm here.
Okay, good. So we continue with this part, right? So let's talk about sexual reproduction in protozoans, right? Now you say asexual reproduction is like cloning, basically, right? So what is sexual reproduction? What is sexual reproduction?
Actually, I think you already displayed that on the slide.
Yeah, good. I just wonder whether you read the slide or not. Right. So the answer is actually on the slides. And now, well, so how they can reproduce asexually when they have only one cell? That's the key issue, right? So are they going to fuse two cells together or what? Scientists find out that there are two types of protozoans in terms of their chromosomal set, right? Some species like existed in the diploid forms. You know diploid? Yep. So over here, I think the font is a bit wrong. Let me check. Okay, there are two. Sorry, this one is so long. All right. Now, there are two types. One type is that they exist in the diploid form. So before they can go for the sexual reproduction, they have go through meiosis instead of mitosis. That you know, right? So the deduction from the diploid into the haploid forms. Okay, and then they form what you call gametes. And gametes are different things to fuse together to form the zygote. And this is the sexual reproduction. So where is sexual reproduction take place? In this diagram. On which part? In this diagram, where is sexual reproduction?
It's from gametes to zygote.
Sorry? Hello? Where is it? In this diagram, where does sexual reproduction take place?
It takes place in the from gametes to zygote.
Yes, very good. So this is also the process that we call fertilization, right? When the combination of two gametes, a fusion of two gametes into a zygote. Now, there are also quite a lot of protozoan species that actually in the normal state, they exist in haploid form instead of diploid. For these, how do they reproduce sexually? They just go through, they just combine one-to-one like this. What do you think? Just that these two haploid individuals fuse together and then they have the new one? Or what? What do you think? No answer? All right. So usually these two forms, right? What you call the other nutrition phase, right? They are only responsible. They are only active in taking food, right? Taking in nutrients, right? In order to reproduce sexually, the haploid individuals have to go through mitosis instead, because they already haploid, right? So they cannot go to meiosis anymore, right? Then they go through mitosis to switch their form from the nutritional form into the sexual stage. Understand? they change their stage by going through mitosis. So from the normal haploid, as usual, into the haploid that can be active in sexual reproduction. And from these two, they fuse together. So I think these two, right, you see the same thing, right? Now, what happened next? What do you think? What will happen next? What happened next?
I actually don't know.
Now, remember, as I said, right, they always exist. Most of the time, they will be the haploid form. They live in haploid form. So they always change the state when they reproduce sexually into gametes, and they go through fertilization, but they end up being diploid individuals, right? They have two N now, two sets of chromosomes now. So in order to go back to the normal stage that they live, right, they have to go through mitosis. Funny, right? But that's how they live. Now, when they go through
I get it
mitosis
now.
to form this, right, this is the normative stage, right? The feeding stage, I would say so. So feeding stage, go into the reproducing stage, go through sexual reproduction, form zygote, go through meiosis, back to the feeding stage. So at the moment, right, this point, right, when they mix together, right, then they have a new combination of the genetic material, new set of chromosome, because like maybe the gametes coming from different individuals, so they can have a new combination of their genetic material, right? So by that way, right, they can renew their, they can create a new combination in their genetic material. That ability that process cannot be done if they keep reproducing asexually. Because if they reproducing asexually, they keep cloning the same copies of the genetic materials. Right? So there's some advantage of the sexual reproduction. I'm sure you know about it. But there's also another point over here is that even from the single cells organisms, there's already exists sexual reproduction. So life do not have to wait until they have multicellular organisms, right? They already can reproduce sexually from the very primitive groups of organisms, single cells organisms. Now, another thing is over here is that because there are two kinds of protozoans, one survive in diploid forms mostly, and the other one in haploid form mostly. Right? Then we have also quite diverse kind of life cycles. The simplest one would be the one that go through asexual reproduction, right? Keep recloning themselves easily. And most of these are actually the haploid ones. Means they have only one set of chromosomes. Okay? Most of them, many of them like that. But if they have sexual reproduction in their life cycles, then things getting more interesting. There can be species with haploid dominant life cycles or diploid dominant life cycles, or they can have both in their life cycles. What does it mean? Now, the diagram I showed you here just now, right? The first one is for the what we call diploid dominant life cycle, because the diploid form exists most of the time in the life cycles. And the other one is haploid dominant life cycles. Now, if we draw into a cycles, then there will be something like this. So for haploid dominant life cycles, most of the time they survive in the haploid form, one N. So there's a very short period of time they exist in the diploid form, right? Only in the zygotes. Most of the protozoans actually go through this kind of life cycles, especially the malaria parasite. Right. So on this stage, They go to asexual reproduction, remember? Multiple fission, right? Schizophrenia, this is asexual life cycle. This is also asexual life cycle. The sexual reproduction only occur here. Sorry. The sexual reproduction only occur here very short period of time. It's only when very short period of time they have like diploid form, and then they quickly change into the haploid forms. Okay, now we have a more complete life cycle of the malaria parasites, right? So basically, what I showed you just now before on multiple fissions, right? This is in human body, right? But the sporozoites are actually in the mosquito body. Okay, so when the mosquito bites a human, right, they release the sporozoites into the human's body. They swim in the blood, and they quickly go through the circulatory system, go to the liver, and they complete one cycles of multiple fission here, and then they started attacking the red blood cells. Then can go for 1 or 2 cycles here. Okay, and after 1 or 2 cycles of asexual reproduction, when they have billions of individuals in the patient's body, eventually many of them be killed by our immune system, right? But then some of them will transform into a form that they call the gametocytes. These are the haploid form that are ready for sexual reproduction. So most of the time here, from the mosquito into the human's body, right, they exist in haploid form. The spot, very short period of time in diploid form is here in the zygote. Is it clear now? When you put everything together, you see the complete picture of the parasite?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, good. What else? Okay, so they also have, they can be like generalized into depending on the groups, right? So the malaria parasite plasmodiums actually belong to the group that we call epicomplexa. Okay, and they can be generalized as this, right? So haploid, diploid, go to meiosis into haploids, and they can go through several rounds of what we call merogony, means they produce like by multiple fission, right? And then they transform into the gametes, and the gametes will be responsible for sexual reproduction. So most of their life cycles is relying on the asexual reproduction. Okay. So depending on the species, sometimes they take a shortcuts. They don't need to go through multiple fission, many rounds of multiple fission here, right? Depending on the group. Okay. So you understand the meaning about schizophrenia now, right? And so other terms that I show in the previous slides, like sporozoid and so on. These are terms actually you don't need to remember because these are in the textbook. So anytime you want to refer, I think the most important part would be the life cycles, right? Where do they live, right? And how do they reproduce in this diagram? Right? This slide just give you some extra information, okay? Okay, so we don't have to memorize on these terms. Okay, so some of them actually deploy dominant life cycle like something very similar to true animal, right? So like human species are true animal, right? So we exist in what? In diploid form, right? So for this is just like the typical sexual reproduction in true animal, in true plants. Right? So most of the time they stay in diploid form and only short period of time in gametes, which are haploid. And there's also some species that actually exist in both. I mean, in the life cycles, like the amount of time they exist in diploid is actually equal to the amount of time they exist in haploid. And they call it the haploid-diploid condominant life cycles. Okay. So they reproduce sexually, but they still exist in the diploid form for long. Then they go through meiosis, and they form spore. Usually the spore is something that I will show you later. The spore are basically the stage where they have the protective cover, so they can survive in a difficult environmental condition, right? So there are two generation of sexual reproduction. There are also generation of the asexual reproduction in the same life cycle. Okay. Oops. Somehow it's doesn't go out. Oops. Okay, let's move on to another kinds of sexual reproduction. And it only occurs in one group of protozoa. The group is the Celiophora. You will also learn about Celiophora next week, right? But we only need to look at the way how they reproduce. In this. So in conjugation, gametes are not formed, but there's still the combination of genetic material. I show you closely in this diagram. Okay. Now basically, the two Celiophorans is quite interesting because they have two nuclei in their cells. Usually the eukaryotic cells have only one nucleus, right? But they have two nuclei in the cells. One is bigger, responsible for the metabolism activities in the cell, and the other one is much smaller, that they call it the micronucleus, and the bigger one is called macronucleus. Okay, now usually this group will just keep reproducing asexually by cloning, right? But then when the environmental condition become a bit more difficult, they will switch the state, maybe by random, right? When the two individuals come into contact with each other, if they send out a proper maybe chemical signal that they agree with each other, that they can do something fun, right? And then they start a process that we call conjugation. That means the two cells of Celiophora stick together. And at the same time, they activate a process that the haploids, the diploid nucleus go through meiosis. So they form the haploid micronuclei. Okay, so from one to go through meiosis, I'm sure you already learned, right? From go through meiosis, from one nucleus, we have four. Okay, among these four, three will disappear, and the remaining one will go through one time of mitosis, phase 2, right? Is it phase 2 of meiosis? Do you remember? Cell division. Okay, if you learn about genetics, I'm sure you know about it, right? So after a while, right, after this meiosis process, in the phase 2, then they have two new, two haploids micronuclei. And the two cells, when they are stick together, they start exchanging. They exchange their small nuclei. So let's say they code the blue and red, right? So the blue one give one micronucleus to the red one, and in return, it receives the red one. Understand?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
That's the process, a part of the conjugation. And they grow to a process that they call it, instead of calling it fertilization, they call it syngamy. Syngamy means that they fuse the gametes. So let's say so they fuse the micronuclei. So when they fuse the red and the blue, let's say we have a new combination. Then we go in green. Over here it is diploid, right? Haploid exchange, fused together, we have diploid forms. Okay. After they have then we have a new combination of the genetic material, new chromosome sets, right? And they go through mitosis. So they from one pair, right? After conjugation, they start reproducing asexually. So they have then babies of different combination. Then go through all this process, right? It's still considered as sexual reproduction because there's a combination of the two haploid nuclei, even though there's no gametes in this process. And that's why they give them a different name, a special name for that, conjugation. In Vietnamese, they call it tiếp hợp sinh sản, hữu tính bằng cách tiếp hợp. Special, right? So no gametes, but still can consider as the sexual reproduction, thanks to the combination of the the haploid nuclei. Is it clear?
Yes.
Okay, so I show you more draft, but quite complete diversity in the way they reproduce, right? But there's also another thing. It's not really related to reproduction, but I mean, also as some of the results of reproduction, some protozoans have the ability to go to what we call hibernation or dormancy. Right? So, for example, when the environmental condition become difficult, some protozoans can go through encysment. It means they are started to secrete a very thick envelope surrounding the cell, right? And these can be resistant from water loss or high temperature, high or low, depending on the species, right? And then they can sleep for a long time. And they can wait until the environmental condition become good again. Then they will break out the cover and they become active again. Right? So some of these species, some of the species have this ability, and therefore they can survive very well in the environment. So it's not really a part of reproduction, but it's also part of the ability for them to survive well. So I give you some ideas here, but actually this phenomenon is not uncommon. We can also see this phenomenon in other group of living organisms, like even in bacteria, we also can see encysment. Right? Some bacteria can excrete the cover and protect themselves for some time. Right? So when you study microbiology, maybe you can see this phenomenon again. In zoology, we call it encysment. Is it clear?
Yes, pretty clear now.
Thank you. Thank you. So, why is it important to know how protozoans are reproduced? Why is it important? Linh Chi?
Yes.
You see the question?
Yes. I think it's important to know how protozoans reproduce because we could have many applications by that, and we could protect the diversity biology.
Okay. What is also important?
I think by knowing how they reproduce, we could apply to produce the medicine or vaccine.
Okay, so I'll also show you the reproduction of the malaria parasites, right?
Yes.
Why do you need to know about the reproduction of malaria parasites?
To prevent it.
Yeah, that's very good. So we know how they can, we know their life cycle, so we know on which stage we can prevent them.
Control it.
You can control them. So you can see that it's like parasites, malaria is like transmitted by mosquitoes. So I think for sure it's easier to kill the mosquito than to kill the patient, right? Right. So we know the important steps that we do, right, to prevent them. And also probably we can look for medicine that try to stop them invading the liver, or maybe try to stop them reproducing in the red blood cells. There are quite a number of medicines that are trying to solve that. So this is really important that we need to know their biology, need to know the way they reproduce, right? Including the good species as well as the harmful species.
Yes.
Very good. Thank you. So that's about it. Right. So for this part, I'll give you some review work, just for some homework. I will post this one on Google Classroom as well, right? Probably we need to spend some time looking at the textbook as well as my lessons here, right? To have a look at the key characteristic of the protozoans, right? By answering some of these questions. Actually, all not some. How do they look? Right. I have questions along the way, right? What are the characters that separate protozoans from other kinds of living organisms? How do they move? Because we consider them as something like animals, right? And how do they carry out osmoregulation? How do they get nutrients? And how do they reproduce? All right.
Yes.
So next week, that's homework. Next week, we'll have a look at the diversity of protozoa. And we are in the textbook. There are actually a lot of groups of protozoans. So you you don't have time to read them all. So we only need to focus on these important groups. Some important groups, including the phylum Organozoa, phylum Cornoflagellata, the two phyla Retotamonada and Associtala. You take note of these names, right? And you look at the textbook, and I already gave you, and have a look at them. I will give you some guides to read, right? And the other one is the phylum Unveolata, and also we should not forget to read the amoeba, right? So what we call the amoeboid protozoans. So how do you read the textbook is another thing, right? So please, like when you read, you take notes of some of the key characteristics of these phyla, right? And then next week we have the comparison between these groups of protozoans. I will take one example here, and you know like what you need to look for in the textbook. Right? So for this part, right, we are looking at the diversity. Actually, in the previous lesson and today's lesson, I already mentioned about the diversity of protozoa, right? They are diverse in shape, they're diverse in size, they're diverse in the way they move, they are diverse in the way they take food, they are diverse in the way they reproduce, right? So But I only gave a general picture. Now we have to look at particular group and try to answer this question for each group on the previous slides. For each of these group, right, you have to look for the textbook and try to answer this question. And next week we'll discuss with each other. What are the unique characteristics? It means the characteristic that they can separate from each other, right? How they move and which structure in their body help them move for each group, and also how they reproduce. Okay, and I think the easiest way for you to do it when you read the textbook, right? Probably you can prepare a piece of paper, maybe A4 size, right? Create a table and compare these groups based on these questions. Understand?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Now I give you one example. There are quite a number of groups, right? The first one I already recommend to you, the Glenosas, right? So let's say we look at the textbook, they will look at, you will find something like this, right? Some figures like this, right? And some text tells you about the key characteristic of the Glenosas. For a Glenosa, there's some key characteristic. The first thing, they have flagella. And remember last time I told you, right? If they have flagella, they will not have cilia. Remember that? But then this one has a unique character that we call the Parisian rod. So we have a cross section of the flagellum beside the exoneme that we already studied last time, right? The nine duplet, right? And there's two single microtubule in the middle, right? But beside that, they also have a structure that they call the Parisian rod, which is quite hard. And scientists believe that they use them to create the better ability to have better locomotion, thanks to this structure, right? They also have very diverse lifestyle. As many species are free living, some of them are autotrophic, and some of them are heterotrophics, and even some are parasitic. So reproduction go through the longitudinal binary fission. So we just look for these keywords in the textbook, right? We look at how they reproduce, right? How they move, right? And this kind of thing, and where they live. And in this group, they are currently classified into two major groups. One is the class Eplanoidae, and the other one is the class Kinetoplastida. So the Eplanoidae, many of them are green. They are green because they have what? Why are they green? You know?
Chlorophyll.
They have chloroplast.
Yeah, so they have chlorophyll, chloroplast in their body, so they can photosynthesize, right? So, but actually not all of them like that. Right? So actually only 1/3 of them can photosynthesize. The majorities are actually heterotrophics, right? And actually the one that can photosynthesize, actually they also can, they can still take food from the environment. They have a reservoir over here. This part is responsible for taking food from the environment, but at the same time they can photosynthesize. So they can maintain two mechanisms of nutrition at the same time. Right? So the body is elongated with a reservoir at the base of the flagellum, right? And they have also the contractile vacuole somewhere here. So these are the key things you need to know, right? And interesting things about this group is that the flagella has a very fine structure on the surface that we call the masticonems. What is it for? What is it for?
To move around.
so when they have the fine structure like this, right? Probably you can think about like look like a feather. Means they increase the surface. Increase the surface area, right? When they can increase the surface area, and maybe they can move around better, because the flagella is very thin, right? So having these mastigoniums, right? They increase the surface area, just like the feather of a bird. Understand?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So this is something that is quite special in this group as well, right? The other group is also very unique, and they have this name called Kinetoplastida because they have a structure that is called kinetoplast. Kinetoplast. What is it? Basically, this group, they have quite a number of things, right? One is they have a big flagellum here, maybe one or two, and this flagellum is I think this something wrong with this one today. Okay. This flagellum is attached to the extension of the cell membrane that can move. They call it undulating membrane. Undulate means they can create this kind of synertia movement. Okay. And then usually they're attached to the flagellum. And also they have a structure that we call kinetoplast. Actually, kinetoplast is just a pack of DNA, but this is the DNA in the mitochondrion. And this one is very interesting in the way that it has a very large mitochondrion. It has only one in the cell, but when they have the specimen, they realize that this mitochondrion is even bigger than the nucleus, right? And they have a very, very big mass of DNA in the mitochondrion. It is near to the base of the flagellum, and they call it kinetoplast. So basically just a pack of DNA in the cell, right, in the mitochondria. Why is it so big? It is probably because many of the species are actually parasites, and for some reason they may need very big mitochondria and only need one. Actually, we don't have a clear answer yet, but it may be related to the parasitic lifestyles. And quite a number of species, and most of them are parasitic. And some of these are quite famous in medical study because they create some of the common disease to human, like leishmaniasis disease, Chagas disease. I'm not so sure about, you hear about Chagas disease and the sleeping sickness. Do you have sleeping sickness?
No.
No, I don't think so. But I know someone who had sleeping sickness.
Okay, so it's not the kind of sickness when you enter the class, right? You enter class, you feel sleepy, right?
Yes, it is not it.
Is that Mr. Yan?
Yes.
That's not that kind of sickness, right? That one is, I will call the class sleeping sickness. Every time students go into class, they fall sleepy, right? Not that kind.
Oh, no.
So we have to look at these
Yes.
things. What are they exactly? Now, leishmania disease is a kind of disease caused by a group of kinetoplastida called leishmania. Right? They are transmitted by sandflies. Sandflies is very tiny flies, right? Even smaller mosquitoes, and they bite quite painfully. So if they have the parasites in that, right, they will go to the skin of the patient. And usually when they get into the skin of the patient, right, they will keep reproducing, and then from very tiny bite, right, the wound can expand like this. But do not worry so much because this kind of disease is not in Vietnam yet. All right, they are mostly in the other part of the world, not in Southeast Asia, so you don't have to worry so much, right? Other kind of disease that we call the Chagas disease is a very complicated disease. caused by other group that we call the Trypanosoma cruzi, right? And also do not worry so much because they are not in Vietnam yet. They are confined, more or less confined to Central and South America. And they are transmitted by a kind of bug that we call the triatomine bug. So the same, they are also similar to mosquito is that they suck the blood from animals. Sometimes they also attack humans. And if they have the Trypanosoma cruzi parasite in it, right, the parasite will go to the blood, and then they go through the circulatory system, and they may attack different parts of the body. They may stay in the muscles of the patient, or maybe they attack other organs of the body. And depending on the organs they attack the body, the patient may have different symptoms. And that's why Chagas disease is very difficult to diagnose because we cannot just rely on the symptoms. Right? If they attack the muscle, we feel muscle pain. If they attack the liver, we have abdomen pain. Right? Then it's very difficult to tell unless we can have a test to identify whether they have the parasites in the blood or not. And usually, because of that, and also they stay in the patient body for quite long before they show the symptoms. And therefore, people are not really aware of the parasites until they fall sick. Right? When they fall sick, it's already like quite difficult to treat. So Chagas disease is one of the not very easily widespread, but it's pretty common in Central and South America. And because of the complication, and also because it's not easy to treat them to cure this disease, right? So at the moment, WHO and also CDC also still pay a lot of attention to this kind of disease. So we need to remember in these ones, right? There's not only COVID. Okay, we also have other disease to pay attention to, right? So we hope that we can overcome the COVID-19 soon, so we can have some more time to look at other problems. Okay, so this one is one of the common disease in South America, and the other one is the sleeping sickness, and the precise name is African sleeping sickness, because thankfully for us, not good for the African people, but for us, right, they are not in Southeast Asia, they are confined to Africa. It's caused by another groups of Trypanosoma, also kinetoplastic, right? And it's transmitted by a kind of fly that we call tsetse flies. So basically, when they bite the patient, right, they release the parasite into the patient. And usually the parasites either go into the body organ and eventually they will go to the brain of the patient. This is when they create the problem. So initially they may attack other organs, but when they reproduce enough, right, they follow the blood vessels, right? They go up to the brain. When they start attacking the brain, the patient starts showing symptoms. The symptom is not sleepiness. Actually, one of the first symptoms would be like the patient cannot sleep properly, and they feel like headache and other problems, right? But then after maybe, depending on the subspecies, after maybe 1 or 2 weeks or 2 months, the patient, if they are not treated well, right, they will fall into a stage that when they lose consciousness, or we call it, they go into the coma. Coma, C-O-M-A. So they just lose consciousness and they look like they are sleepy. You know what I mean? So this kind of like sleeping sickness is like when the patient fall into that coma stage, it's just like they're sleeping. And usually when they enter that stage, they cannot get up again. Once they get into that stage, we cannot wake them up anymore. So they just keep lying down like that until they pass away. So depending on the subspecies, once they enter the sleeping phase, right, it's already the final phase, like maybe but few weeks, few months, or maybe up to a year. Right? So this is also quite a common disease in Africa. This is quite scary because like the patient would just like lying there for months or 1 or 2 years before they really cannot handle it and they go away. Okay, so this is also quite a scary disease. So people when they go to Africa, they have to pay really attention to this one. Okay, it can be cured, but they have to do it before the patient fall into the sleeping stage. When they fall into sleeping, yeah, something like that, right? So it's not very peaceful anyway. So actually, the two subspecies, and they find two different subspecies in different part of Africa. The eastern part is are dominated by one subspecies, and the western part is another subspecies, and they have different level of severity. One is like very quick; they can kill the patient within a few months, and the other one is slower; they kill the patient after like maybe 1 or 2 years. So these are some of the examples. So this is the main thing that I want you to look at when you read the textbook, right? So you try to ask some of these questions, right? What are they unique, right? So the unique can be about the structure or maybe about the ability, right? Do they cause any harm to human, let's say so, right? How do they move, right? What the structure they reproduce, for moving, right? For example, this one, like kinetopsis, so we have the unique structure is the flagellum attached to the undulating membrane, right? And they have a kinetoplast. That's a unique structure. For the glenoidae, they have the mastigonems as a unique structure, right? And for the glenozoas, right, they have pyroxene rock as a unique structure. So look at the textbook, try to find some of these keywords and make it as the table. Understand?
Yes.
Yes.
On paper. All right. So next week, when you go back, I will discuss with you what you read from this textbook, right? And you focus on this phyla in this group. Is it clear, everyone?
Yes, it is clear.
Okay, so there are many more protozoans in the textbook, but we don't have time, so we only need to focus on these groups. Okay? Of course, if you are curious, you can read more on other parts of the textbook, but for this week, let's focus on this book. All right?
You will send us the slide, right?
Sorry?
You will send us the presentation, right?
Did I send to you last week?
Oh.
Did I send lecture notes to you last week? Yes, right? So of course, this week I will send again. So I have the habit that after every lesson, I will send to you. So do not worry about it. Okay?
Okay.
So right after this, I will send you. Okay, so do you have other question?
For now is no, but maybe after we read the textbook and maybe we will have some questions for the next.
Okay, so if you
lesson.
Okay, so if you have a question, right, I think you can post on the Google Classroom. For example, you can post under the lecture notes. Understand?
Okay.
So you have comments here, right? You have a question, you just post here, then I will answer anytime possible.